Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 16th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of September 28th, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I am excited to talk about the idea of what we left off on last week, which was the question of where do we need to be less efficient? And I find it kind of interesting for me because I feel like I've been a little less efficient this week. I have had my ear plugged for almost a week now. And so watching your body adjusting to hearing things a little bit different out of one ear, where it's kind of coming and going and it's not necessarily the same. One of our loyal listeners responded with the idea of when we have a lot of irons in the fire, when we have a lot of things going, it's really easy for us to overlook the people who we should be thanking and who are taking time out of their day to be less efficient to help us. And for me, I would even piggyback on that is the aspect of how well our bodies are able to adapt when our body is not running the most efficient that it possibly can. When we are hurt, when we are injured, when we are going through things, that our body is able to adapt and change. And I think this is the aspect also for us to remember and be able to look at and think about that God works in, I think, similar ways as well. That God purposely puts barriers around God's self. And the idea that God then knows that God isn't going to always be 100% efficient, but this is what's better for the people. They aren't ready for this. So I'm going to work for this instead. And I think that's an important thing for us to get our heads around, and especially in a world where we want to strive to be efficient all the time. I think sometimes that's where we can lose sight of it. And again, this week in the gospel, we get back to and we have this continued idea of talking about when we look at efficiency, especially in the 21st century mindset that we have, looking at these texts, efficiency usually equals higher income and what problems can arise from that. I think we're going to get into a little bit. And I think there's a few things that we can look at and think about, but then we also then need to contemplate then what are our ramifications from that. So let's just jump into it. One of the Old Testament texts this week can be Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 1 to 3a and 6 through 15. So if you're continuing through the semi-continuous aspect of going through Jeremiah here, this is a moment where Jeremiah's cousin, Hanamel, comes to him and states, I have some land, I'm looking to get rid of it. Now, at this point and in this time, families get first right at lands. You're passing them down. And this is a moment where, remember, the people of Israel have been kind of exiled. They have been going place to place. They have had a lot of turmoil, the temple being taken over. And this is a moment where we get in this verse 15 where Jeremiah gets this land and then is turning it over to another person in the presence of Hamel and essentially stating this is where the vineyards are going to be. This is where the people of Israel are going to be. And essentially, let's bring this land back. Let's restore this land. Let's bring back the idea that we're not just going to constantly be on the road. We are going to be around for a long, extended period of time. And I think that's a great homage and thing for us to remember that even in difficult times, God continues to be there for his people. The psalm that then goes with that then is Psalm 91, verses 1 to 6 and 14 through 16. And this then is this recognition on how God has continued to be there for us and protect us and still guides us as long as we are able to recognize it and as long as we are able to continue to give God praise and homage for that, but recognizing that God is the one who is providing this. God is the one who is protecting us. And I always enjoy a bird reference, and we have a bird reference in verse 4 talking about his pinions under his wings, which would be your major flight feathers, protecting you from difficulties and things that are going on. So this recognition of how God continues to provide a shelter for God's people, and that ties in beautifully with the Jeremiah text. The other Old Testament text that you can have is from Amos chapter 6, verses 1a and 4 through 7. And this then is this recognition yet again on how at times Israel at this moment has certain people who are getting very lazy. I have made it. And look, and they're flaunting their money in different ways. They are relaxing. They are drinking quite a bit of wine. They are in this phase of settling down and relaxing and taking advantage of the wealth that they have accomplished. And this then is a warning is coming in verse 7, therefore they shall be the first to go into exile, and revelry for loungers shall pass away. This idea of how while they are lounging, while they are taking this, they are not preparing for what potentially is still coming. So this recognition on they have let their morals down, they have relaxed so far, they are no longer letting themselves actually be prepared for what is coming. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 146, all 10 verses of it. And this is this recognition of as we continue to praise God, we put our trust into God, not putting our trust into ourselves, and recognizing that this is what actually provides us the joy to be able to recognize how God has continued to take care of us, how God has continued to make sure that we are provided for, how God continues to take care of our day-to-day needs and watching out for us and taking care of those strangers around us, that this then allows for God to reign forever. And thus we should give praise to that. The epistle text this week, or second reading, comes from 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 to 19. And this then is this recognition on, yet again, I think verse 10 being really important, that the love of money is the root of evil, but it's not that the money is the root of evil, it is the love of money. And in doing that, this then can separate us from God and separate us from what Christ was striving to do for us. Because when we are emphasizing what money is doing for us, and putting a greater emphasis on that, we are losing sight of the manifestation of what Jesus did for us, the forgiveness of sins, saying that there was nothing that we necessarily needed to do, but continue to then show the light of what this renewal within us is doing. And if we are consuming that and taking that and twisting that to, then I am benefiting monetarily in this, then this gets to this idea of how I don't need to do anything, and that's not what we're called into doing. And it ties a little bit back to that Amos text. The Amos text, one of the things that I think is also really important here is there is no signs here where Jesus is stating or God is stating in Amos's text that life is going to necessarily be easy because we're following this way. We're following the way of what Christ is calling us into. It's not saying that we're getting easy street. By no means. It means that we have to continue to be doing things. This is not something then we should be just lounging back on. And that if this message and this recognition of what Christ did for us is truly what we believe, this is something that requires active participation, active pursuit, and thus this means that we cannot just be focused on what money is doing for us individually. We have to be looking around us a lot more and not being focused on the money itself, being focused on the mission of what Christ has sent us out to do. The gospel text this week then is out of Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. This is then where we're jumping into a parable here where the idea of how we have a rich man and a poor man named Lazarus. And the rich man lives lavishly while Lazarus struggles to even eat from the rich man's table, getting licked by dogs and the sores to be able to have him healed. And so then we get the deaths of both of them. The angels bring the poor man Lazarus up to heaven with Abraham and all the descendants. And meanwhile, the rich man goes down to Hades, talks about how hot it is, wishing that Lazarus could dip his finger in water just to give him a break. They say no. He then asks also the rich man to warn his brothers, and Abraham is responding with, you have the prophets, you have all these people. Why are you needing this additional invitation? Why are we needing these additional things? Do you think you need this because you're this rich man that you're suddenly needing this additional information? It's already being given to you. Why can't you just listen like everyone else? But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and direction and ways to be looking at the text week after week. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend that. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but along with also having art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, even daily devotional readings that you can go through to help prepare for the week after week. This is really important. Being able to look at and think about how other people interpreted these texts artistically, what are some different prayers that can be tied into this? How do we prepare week after week to make sure that when we are in the pews, whether we're in front of them or in them, that when we get to that moment of worship, we are fully prepared. We recognize what's going to be going on, and it allows us to go just that little bit deeper. And that's so important for us to be able to grow in the faith. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, along with some different events and resources to be looking at and thinking about the text in more of an ecological lens. If you enjoy listening to this podcast week after week, I know you're going to enjoy the different ecologicals reflections on these texts. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. So it'll be the first links down in the show notes. One of the things I think is really difficult when we're thinking about this text, especially for me where I'm at being in the United States, we have to recognize in a lot of ways we are set up as the rich man, especially compared to the history of life here in the world. We are a rich country. We are rich people. Even though if you may feel like in America, I'm middle income or even low income, you still are considered most likely rich compared to many other parts of the world and many parts of history in and of themselves. So when we think about it and read the text then that way, we then have to recognize that in that, what is being conveyed? What are we trying to understand here to make sure that we are getting the most out of it? And I think one of the things right now within the United States we need to recognize is there are certain advantages that we have had that are now being challenged. And I think it's something that we need to reflect on a little bit. And in order for us to get to that place, we need to understand some things that are going on within the world for us to be able to contemplate and think about these things. First and foremost, I think many of us understand the importance of blood. And we've talked about blood typing actually semi-recently within the last 3 months, talking about how, yes, there's the traditional 8 that we are taught in schools, but there is also huge numbers of other blood types that we're figuring out in our slight modifications and things of that nature. And how that then can make it very difficult for us to be able to get blood donations and things of that nature, and how in general, we still struggle with blood donations. And part of that is with the current process of being able to donate and use blood. So when you donate blood, your blood lasts for 42 days. And after that, it needs to be disposed of because it is starting to fall apart. Again, remember, this is something your body produces and it's not meant to last forever. You have your red blood cells that go through controlled cell death at a period of time. And what you are giving people with blood, one of the major things is red blood cells. And it's allowing them to be able to then continue on as their body is trying to produce enough as they are gone through usually some type of major trauma to go through that. And one of the biggest things that we still run into is death happening because how we are working with blood now, it needs to be refrigerated. You get the complexities with insurance and even just within ambulances not being able to have refrigeration. Can you give it in an ambulance? All these different aspects. And this is causing a lot of deaths in general based off of blood shortages. So with that being the case, there has been strives for decades on trying to figure out some type of artificial blood to be able to be administered or being able to have something a little bit more shelf stable. And we have heard here now in the last few months, there's a couple different things that are starting to look a little bit more optimistic with this, with a few drawbacks that we're still going to need to continue to work through. So one of them is coming out of Japan. And essentially what it is doing, it is taking the red blood cells out of blood that is going to be expired and taking out the hemoglobin and putting around like a lipid protection to essentially make an artificial red blood cell, per se. And then putting it into a liquid to be able to be mimic blood. And again, now you're getting into, yes, there's scientific papers on it, but also they also have to somewhat protect their own IT type of idea of they don't want to give away their secret sauce. But what then is happening here in Japan through some initial studies and now a further bigger initial studies here in 2025 of being able to administer this artificial blood into people. And the cool thing with that is it doesn't need to be refrigerated. So what they're noticing is that it has a shelf stable life of 2 years. And if refrigerated, up to 5 years of being shelf stable. Now, this is really cool. Again, it's still being very dependent on human beings being able to donate blood, but it also helps us reduce our waste. But it still comes with a drawback of there's a lot of additional things within our blood, like platelets that we've talked about for helping with clotting, to white blood cells to be able to help fight different things that are going on in the body and helping to carry nutrients in the blood in and of itself. And unfortunately, from these early tests, that is not what is happening with this version. But it's at least a step in the right direction. And one of the other things that we are also stating at the same time coming out of the University of Maryland, we have a doctor named Dr. Alan Doctor who has come up with erythromere, which is essentially a freeze-dried version of being able to take, again, blood that's on the way out, being able to separate the hemoglobin out, freeze-drying it to get it into a powder, and then taking that powder and mixing it with water to be able to, within a minute, being able to make a blood that would go in. But yet again, we're still running into these same issues of not being able to cover nutrients, not being able to bring in white blood cells, not being able to bring in platelets, but initially being able to have that step to start with some of this stuff could be extremely important. And this is one of the things that is so fascinating, so important, and it's something that now looks like we're maybe getting some headway. Being able to create these universal blood types, essentially, that it's taking away the different protein markers for positive, negative, or making sure that there isn't the sugars attached to it to give you A, B, or AB or O. Taking all of that away to be able to give in the blood is fantastic. But that's where, especially as a United States citizen, and I would even argue as a world citizen, that we're also starting to run into is the different cutbacks here in the United States that we've also had within how we are giving out grants, how we are looking at things. And again, I know that gets into politics, and I'm trying not to necessarily say one way or the other, but what I will say is when you are drastically reducing the amount of money to be able to go into medical research or research in general, you're not only hurting your economy now by having people getting laid off and things of that nature, you're also taking people who have done extensive research and they're going to go and look for other jobs, other places. So you're losing some of that experience, but you also don't know what the long-term ramifications are because you don't know what would have happened if you kept things together, if you had provided the funding. There's a great link I'll put down in the show notes talking with Dr. Mike, if you've ever listened to him on YouTube, talking about how some of the different cuts here in the United States are directly affecting the idea of what will happen over the next 10, 20, 30 years of medical research, because you don't have people working on these projects anymore because the funding isn't there. And this is very hard to necessarily quantify what that's going to do. And so that's where I kind of flip this back around, and how important it is if we are looking at and thinking about that we are a rich country, that we are a rich person, that we're not just sitting back like Amos was talking about and figuring out how to accumulate our money or doing things to make sure that for certain people things are easier. Instead of looking at the broad scope of, if we are able to work together on these projects, if we are able to make significant breakthroughs within, like today's example of artificial blood, and being able to build upon that and being able to not only impact the United States, but the world. Now you could argue you have taken your resources and actually done something that significantly impacts everybody. You have not just sat on your wealth and said, this is good enough. You have now recognized that this is a tool that then can allow us to be able to provide and help for others. These texts challenge us to look out beyond ourselves. These texts challenge us to think about, how do we provide and take care of others around us? And in theory, that is what science should be helping us do. It's doing observations, and through those observations, sharing it with other people so that we can learn from each other and make better decisions going forward. Take these findings, these observations, these understandings of how we understand things to be working, present them for other people so that we can, as a collective group, make better decisions all together. Being able to produce artificial blood, even if it isn't perfect, is a major step in the right direction. It's a major step in being able to help people. And we will continue then to put more research into that to be able to move us forward, and being able to figure out ways to really help make even better artificial blood and more shelf stable, and being able to help in places that maybe don't have the same infrastructure that us as a rich country does. And that's one of the things for me, as I have been sitting and processing what has been happening over roughly the last year. And when we ever start talking about cutting back research dollars, that's directly looking at our health, directly looking at the biological sciences in some form or fashion, I think it's something that actually then affects all of us. There's so much research that ends up trickling down and benefiting us in so many different ways. And if we are taking those dollars and saying we are prioritizing budget, which is, I understand it's important, but it's also an arbitrary number over people, which is not an arbitrary number. I find that really difficult. I find that then we are closer aligning ourselves with the rich man. I find that we are closer aligning ourselves with what Amos is warning us about. I find us that we are not listening to the 46th Psalm. We are praising ourselves instead of taking the time to recognize the beauty of what God has done for us. And in doing that, this First Timothy reading comes alive, that we then have become our own saviors in different ways based off of our love of money, that it's going to take care of everything, instead of putting our faith into what we claimed it is so important to us faith-wise, our faith, and recognizing that Christ is the one, and giving Christ the ability to help utilize that resource to benefit more than just ourselves, benefit whole communities. And is that not what we see Jeremiah doing? When everything seems to be just crap, Jeremiah still then gets an opportunity, recognizes that it's the Lord's opportunity, and then is saying, we're going to go and restore this land. We're going to continue to get people to understand that no, God has not abandoned us, no matter how difficult things are. I know in a lot of things and how the last few weeks have been. And honestly, I know that over the next few years, it's still probably going to be very crazy, politically, at least here in the United States. But it doesn't mean that we should be giving up hope. I think then it means that we need to continue to buckle down and recognize what is really important to us. I think it's also the moments for us to recognize and look at how do we take and look at and figure out ways that really benefit all people, not just some people. Part of what makes things great is when someone is able to recognize their greatness and help others in their times where they aren't doing as great. And that's when you really recognize how great you are, that you are able to then help lift and elevate others. In theory, that's what we should be doing. In theory, that's what science does. In theory, we should be able to create an artificial blood and it's going to save millions of lives based off of that. The samples that we have in human trials in some cases, and some are still in animal styles, depending. Freeze-dried is still in animal stages, whereas the artificial blood that's coming out of Japan, that one is in human trials. It's start. But I think anybody who's working on this stuff would recognize and tell you that it's not a finished product. This is version 1. There's a lot of work to still be done. We don't want to just sit on our laurels and say, look, we've been able to produce this and look how great this is, without recognizing there's still ways to make it better, to benefit and help more people. When we lose sight of the idea of us working together to benefit all people, not just some, I think we are a better world when we keep that vision in front of us. Because I would argue that this is more of what God is calling us into. We are constantly being told to be looking out and caring for people who aren't doing as well. We are constantly being told to look and to observe the world around us and learn from it. And that means that we need to invest our dollars into that as well. Our love of money can steer us in misguided ways. And we've talked about how difficult it is for science to work on just the aspect of you need dollars, and that's not necessarily what science directly makes. It gives you, this is our understanding of how things work, and others go and make dollars out of it. And unfortunately, it's still a messed up system, and we've talked about that before. But I think it's still also this idea that we have to get our heads around, that as much as money helps things, we don't want to lose sight of once we are acquiring it to hoard it. We need to still recognize, just like the world in which we live on is a gift, so is the gift of money. So is the gift of research. So is the gift of protection. So is the gift of all these things that are given to us freely by God. So where are we going to invest our time, our resources, our money? Is it going to be in selfish endeavors, or is it going to be in things that benefit more than just yourself? And I think that's the question for this week. Where are you going to invest? In yourself purely, or in others where there actually is an ability to multiply that money, to multiply that resource? Where are you going to invest? In yourself or in the community of all of us? I think in ways, when we put it that way, it's really simple for us to say, of course, we're going to do it in others, but does our actions reflect that? And I think that's what's hard, because it isn't necessarily always straightforward. It isn't necessarily easy to define. It's not easy to necessarily do. And in a lot of times it means personal sacrifice. But with following the way that we do, with following what Christ did for us, we should get our heads around the idea that sacrifice is necessary and required. I think that's something that we need to learn from and think about. Because when we do, and we truly understand that, I think that's when we can start understanding the benefit of what donations for helping in research to get to artificial blood and how big of an impact that truly can be. I think then we can start looking at these huge humanitarian efforts as people, when we all work together, how much more impact that actually has. It is better to give than to receive. And in order for us to give, we have to have our eyes open to see who needs the receiving of that. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.